Greetings, my dear students. Welcome to ENG 220, weeks 5 and 6. Writing your short story. The instructions for the short story you're now writing ask you to build the narrative around a central character. We all know from our experience of film, literature, and everyday life what a character in a story might look like. For example, in some of your exercises for this course, especially activity number 1, there is a distinct folkloristic tendencies with heroes and princesses, and so on. It is recommended that you draw on your literary experience when writing this story. Take time to read some of the stories in the textbook. Today I would like to refer to one of these stories and comment on the way the author has represented the central character. It is the story I read several years ago when I first came to Kabul, in fact. But I would like to thank the student in this class who brought it to my attention last week. The story is called The Dark, and it is written by Irish writer John McGann. Let me say that this writer spent most of his life living and working in small towns and villages in Ireland. The world he lives in is far from the big cities with urban and sophisticated social forms. His novels and short stories are of intense and in-depth explorations between people, especially family members and citizens from villages whose lives are brought together in an inescapable way. In the story, The Dark, an older woman recounts or retells the story of a family drama. It seems that at some time in the past, the son offended the father's religious beliefs. We're not told the details. At the time, immediately upon offending the father's beliefs, the son had offered an apology. The father rejected it, and the son left the house, creating a permanent rift. It is worth mentioning that the father was a violent man and had treated his son, when a small boy, with physical violence. Now, at the time the story is being told, the mother recounts the episode where the son offended the father. It's quite possible that the son has come back. She tells it with great bitterness and anger towards the son. Now, in this story, the father is the main character, even though he is only ever described in the third person. We don't meet the father. Through his absence, he is present. What is more, the father is dead. Strangely, the element in the story that gives personality to the father is a pair of boots. The father, when he came home in the past, would take his boots off and put them by the fire to dry. And now that the father is dead, the boots are still by the fire. The boots still by the fire are the only thing, in a way, that remain of him. The boots seem to have a character. Of course, somehow the boots have, in the mother's mind, become symbolic of the man who wore them. The bit of wet grass that may have got stuck to them speaks of his daily activities out in bad weather. The calmness of the boots speaks of the father's calm. Some quality of the boots speaks of the man's physical strength. Somehow the boots are seen as faithful to the father, while the son is seen as selfish. Bizarrely, the boots are seen as more devoted to the Father than the Son ever was. The main thing is that an image of the Father is presented, a very powerful image, without him ever making an appearance. This is not to say that I'm asking you to do the same thing, but please keep in mind the powerful effect of well-placed brushstrokes. Try it. Experiment with it. Let me have a very simple example here. Yeah? Let's say you're writing about a young man and you want to describe his appearance. You don't need to say he had thick brown curly hair with the fringe hanging over his eyes. Rather, you can say, the boy walked slowly towards me, his brown hair translucent under the white light of the midday sun, one hand holding the axe, the other brushing his fringe away from his surprisingly small eyes. You see the effect there. You incorporate, you don't describe the character as if the qualities of the description are somehow external to the character. You make your description of the character, the description of the character's exterior, the colour of hair, the kind of clothes they're wearing, the kind of nose they have, the kind of thing they're holding in their hand, the kind of fence that they're walking past, the kind of tree they're walking past. You make these things somehow a part of the character, and in this way you bring the character alive. Okay. I mention this because there is a tendency to feel that that which defines a character in a story is what the character says and what the character thinks. Of course, this is true, and it's a very important part of a character. But think of the story, The Dark, by John McGarren, the one we just discussed. We never know what the Father thinks. We never really hear his voice. All we see his boots, that's it. Yet, in seeing those boots, we know, as far as literature is concerned, everything there is to know about the Father. Okay, now this brings us on to setting, because what we're actually discussing here is the way we use setting to flesh out our characters, to give flesh to our characters, not just to create a kind of background or a kind of decoration that sets the scene through which our character passes. Setting, in fact, plays a very important metaphorical function in the story. Setting is very much part of the meaning of the story, or at least the way a story produces meaning. Now, I'm going to tell you about a story that I like very much. We're talking about setting. There's a story I like very much to read and have read many times. It is called Vendetta and was written by 19th century French writer Guy de Maupassant. It's a short story, 5 pages long. Read it. In the story, the young son of an old woman is murdered. There being nobody to avenge the death, the old woman must do it, which she does in the most astonishing way. Keep in mind that she's very old and she's very weak. The story is set on the island of Corsica, between France and Italy. Corsicans, like other peoples from the Mediterranean, are considered to be very tough people. Their cultures are ancient, their economies are poor. They live amongst the rocks under the hot sun, with their olive trees and their grapevines. The opening pages of the story Vendetta describe the landscape. In 2 paragraphs, without mentioning a single living human being, mentioning only the rocks and the sun, the mountains and the wind and the sea, the characters of the story have been given certain qualities, as if the qualities of the landscapes pass in to the characters, giving them psychological detail. Now the thing is, in this story, Vendetta, very little psychological detail is given. It doesn't say she felt, she said, she thought, oh, she was so sad. There is nothing like that. The psychology that characters have is given by the landscape. This, of course, can lead to some kind of stereotyping, so you have to watch out for it. Not everybody who lives amongst the Rocky Mountains of some, let's say, Mediterranean village has the same characters. I imagine in a country like Afghanistan, there are well-established connections between psychology and landscape. Use these connections, experiment with them. You don't have to record them or repeat them as they come to you. Be creative with them. Now, in my own writing, my own short story writing, I like to think that the first real literary challenge I faced was not what should I write, but how to write about something that was not there. Let me explain. My character was a child. He woke early in the mornings, went out into the fields where he expected to find his father working in the fields. Every morning the father worked in the fields. Every morning the child went out into the fields to meet and be with his father. This was, if you like, a routine that gave the child's world some kind of meaning. On this particular morning, the father was not there. The question is how to indicate the absence of the father. It's not enough simply to say the father was not there, or the boy was shot not to find his father. This is okay, but it's not literature. This is how I did it. I established that every morning there were certain sounds to do with the father. For example, perhaps the sound of digging in the earth. I established that every morning arriving in the field, the father would hang his jacket over the fence. So, I wrote something like this. The boy came. The boy woke up. The boy got out of bed. The boy had his breakfast. The boy came out into the fields. The world of the fields was silent. No soft rhythm of a man digging. No jacket hanging on the fence. Nothing. And so on. So, this was it was a key event in the story, the absence of the father, and I felt that it needed to be described indirectly. And in so doing, you say something about the boy and something about the father. Okay, now, I want you to read the passage along these lines. I want you to read the passage on page 89, Linda Anderson's 89, from Ian McEwan's novel, Atonement. The room is described by a person coming into it. She describes what she passes, what she moves towards, a world independent, not dependent on her being there. Light coming in the windows, creating shapes in the room. The luxury, sofas, vases, rosewood, heavy curtains. A perfect world aesthetically, economically. A world of privilege. But something happens to break this world. A terrible lie is told, and an innocent man goes to prison. The world shatters. Even if the furniture and the room is still there, the world is not there. Then there comes a war, and that way of living is apparently washed away forever, replaced, of course, by new forms of privilege, new styles. Experiment with it. Thank you. Goodbye.